Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome again to one of our Afrocentric lecture series, except this time it is a dialogue, which is a partnership between Arise Black Child and Mutapa Afrocentric lecture series. And this year, this time around, we are focusing on Okamela Uchopo, Umgcina Omhle, on the occasion of the 74th anniversary of his birthday. Many of you that have been following us will recall that this year, in September on the 12th, we reflected on the 43rd anniversary of his assassination, and we elected to look at Pamela through the lens of Nathaniel Julius, who was a young black boy from a township called Eldorado Park, near Soweto in Johannesburg, who was also killed brutally by the police. And we were drawing those parallels between Umgcina Omhle in the way that he died and the way that Nathaniel Julius was also murdered by the police. So here now we are going to reflect on the day of his birth, because the 18th of December marks the birthday of Okamela Omhle. And I have with me Usompisi Upodide Umpemba, who's going to also participate in this dialogue from the Mutapa end. And then we also have Undlondo Umsibi, who's going to be joining us from Arise Black Child. And as an introduction for many of you that may not know, Ubalo Pamela, who is Stephen Bantu Biko, because a lot of people don't even know about Uyo Pamela. No, why has Buza Stetangavan? Who is Stephen Bantu Biko, and where does it come from? Why is it so important in the political history of Black people? And not just in Azania, but across the world. So we are going to request Undlo to take us through some of the beginnings and early life experiences, and how he became, one of the most recognized symbols of Black consciousness in Azania and across the world. So Ndlondo siyakmema mfowethu ukuthi must take us through, and then thereafter we are also going to go over, the meaning of his ideas in the current era. Black consciousness as he has interpreted, because we know that he's not the originator of Black consciousness, but he has, formulated a sort of understanding that is in many ways reflective of his signature and his life experience and the lived and existential condition of Black people in Azania. He was able to locate the struggles of Black people in Azania within, a particular ideological framing of Black consciousness. And we will then reflect on the meaning of that in the current political era, in the current epoch, and also how his ideas have influenced many other struggles, both here domestically but also globally. So Mpemba will take us through that. And then from there, we will then have an open dialogue on just other ideas that may come up. But as a start, Ndlondo siyacela ukuba ukhe usitshayelele ngeligorha, the martyr, of African liberation, just so that our audiences can have an understanding of who he is and what it means to us. Over to you, Ndlondo.
Ngiyabonga Shweme, thank you so much. It continues to be a very great honor to talk about such great men. Last time we spoke about Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe, and I find it very interesting that today we speak of Stephen Bantu Biko, whom in more ways than one I consider as a political heir of Ubaba Umangaliso. And so it's a great honor. I'm very humbled to talk about, and I will use Sombisi's word here, to talk about such a colossus of a man. And like you said, my job is quite simple. I'm going to answer the question of who is Stephen Bantu Biko, and I'm just going to try my best to give people a clear picture of the man in question that we are going to interrogate and zoom into his political life today. So Stephen Bantu Biko was born obviously on the 18th of December 1946. And he was born in a place called Takastad, which is in the Eastern Cape. This is where his grandmother's house actually was. But they did not stay here for long. In 2 years, they moved to a place called Ginsberg. And they moved to a particular section called the Brownlee section at Zaula Street. So this was literally 2 years after he was born in 1948 that they moved to Ginsberg. Uzalwa ke ngubaba Umzingaye Biko, and the mother is Nokuzola Alice Maqete, that is the mother. And in 2 years after they moved to Ginsberg, this is now in 1950, Ubabake Umzingaye passed away. His father was a policeman and later was a clerk in the King Williamstown at the Native Affairs Office. And he is said to have been a very intelligent man who died before he could finish his law degree. He was busy doing his law degree with UNISA at the time of his passing. So this happens when Stephen Bantu Biko is only 4 years old. And so practically Biko, along with his siblings, was raised by their mother. So Umama Alice practically raised Abu Biko. And yes, so the mother then was a domestic worker as well as a cook at Grey Hospital, which was also in King Williamstown. And then Stephen Bantu Biko, I'm just going to touch briefly on his childhood and his primary schooling, his high school. I will touch on his further education. And I'll talk about NUSAS and all those other things at a later stage. So he's remembered by his friends to have had a very great sense of humor. He was quite mischievous, according to his primary school teacher as well. Barefoot, and he was quite a mischievous boy. But also he was very intelligent. And Kutiwa, although his friends never saw him study, he was one of the brightest kids in the class. And he would even go as far as helping other kids that did not understand their lessons. He goes to a Forbes grant when he does his high schooling. And here we learn that he was very studious and he excelled in mathematics and he excelled a lot in English. This is where he also meets Uleri Bekwa. And after completing their junior certificate, they go to Lovedale. In Lovedale, they join his brother, Steve Biko's brother, Ukaya, who was already at Lovedale. Now, his brother, Ukaya, was very politically involved with the PAC. And he was also involved with IPUNCO, which is the military wing of the PAC. And shortly after Steve Biko joins his brother at Lovedale, the police took Ukaya as well as Ubiko into custody because of Kaya's involvement with the PAC and with the military wing in particular. And they then release Stephen Bantu Biko, and after some few months, they actually come back to interrogate him further. And we learn that he was then expelled from the school, Elavdale, because of all of this. And this is actually where Ubiko's political awakening happened, because he was very disgruntled and he was very displeased by the treatment of the white authorities, of the police. And he was so displeased by this that this is where his political interests actually emerged. His brother actually appreciates this experience because he says that he had tried several times to get Steve Biko to be conscientized and to be, politicized, but he was not interested. And he actually then appreciates this experience by the white authorities, and he actually says they gave birth to one of the greatest political activists in South Africa. So because of that treatment, Steve Biko, the one we know, is actually where he started to emerge. Now, obviously, having been expelled, his brother became very concerned about him, and he was, writing a lot of letters to various schools to get Steve accepted. And he succeeded at St. Francis College in Marion Hill, which is in KwaZulu-Natal. And this happened in 1964. But remember, by this time, Biko was extremely politicized. So when he comes into this school, he's already very active on issues of political interests and current affairs. And when he gets to St. Francis College, he actually becomes the vice president of the debating society there, and he takes a very keen interest in debating political affairs and political issues. And he is said to have been one of the brightest students at that time, and his friends really appreciated the political acumen that he had, and he is said to have helped them with a lot of questions that they had politically, or things that they could not quite resolve. Ubiko took the shine by coming in and giving a lot of political clarity at that stage. After matriculating from St. Francis, Steve Biko was admitted to Durban Medical School at the University of Natal at the non-European section. And this happens in 1966. Now, when Biko gets to this place, he finds the blacks have their own SRC, and Biko was actually elected into the SRC when he was still doing his first year. The SRC formed part of the National Union of South African Students, the NUSAS. So the SRC formed part of a bigger body of students, which was the NUSAS. But Ubiko was quite disgruntled with this body because it was dominated by white students, even in the ranks of leadership. And thus he felt that they didn't have the capacity to represent black students or advance their interests. Even before he got into the NUSAS, he was quite uncomfortable with joining them for the reasons that I've already stated. But it was a conference he attended where black students were housed in a different place. They were actually taken to a church. This is where he got really disgruntled, and where he really then made a decision to leave this body. And this is where ISASO was established. This is how ISASO began to come into play, because they were not pleased with INUSAS, which clearly, were pushing their own interests, and they felt sidelined, they felt marginalized, and they even went to the extent of sidelining them at the conference by housing them differently. And this is what really disgruntled Ubiko, along with his other, friends. And this is where the SASO was born. So they were particularly disadvantaged by their small number, as well as by the use of English as the medium of the conference, and by the distance between their concerns and those of the white students. And so Steve and his fellow Black students actually decided to walk out of that conference. And like I said, this is where talks about a Black body that would solely look into Black interests, SASO was then formed. Obviously, ISASO was undergirded, and it was driven by Black consciousness. Black consciousness is what drove ISASO, and its influence actually quickly spread all over the country. Black consciousness even influenced the 1976 Soweto uprising, because they went even as far as influencing high schools. So in more ways than one, if people didn't know, Steve Biko is very much behind the 1976 Soweto uprising that we saw in Soweto. Now, after some time, they felt that they needed to expand their influence, and they needed to expand, their activities beyond university campuses. And they felt that they needed to reach out to the larger community. And this is where the BPC, the Black People's Convention, was formed for a greater influence, like I said, beyond the university campuses at that time. And they set up numerous programs, including a clinic that they launched, which was called Izanimpilo. And this is how they then expanded their influence beyond the universities at that time. We then know that Steve Biko was captured by the police in 1977. And it was actually at a point where he was trying to get the different political parties to come together and have a common vision and have a common, ground. He was trying to bring together, and he was trying to facilitate the unity of EPAC and ANC and all alike political parties. It was at this particular point that Steve Biko was captured, and we all know that he was then stripped, and he was manacled for 20 days before he was transferred to the Sanlam building in Port Elizabeth, where the security police were based. He was told to remain standing, but he defied his captors and sat down. And infuriated, Captain Cybert manhandled him, but Steve fought back. Steve was badly beaten, and between the night of 6 September and the morning of 7 September, he sustained a brain hemorrhage. Despite his injury, the police kept him shackled in a growl, still naked. Doctors examined him. They yielded to the security police by glossing over Steve's injuries. Dr. Ivor Lang could find nothing wrong with Steve on the 7th of September when specialist Dr. Benjamin Tucker examined Steve. he suggested that badly injured, he suggested that the badly injured detainee be taken to hospital, but he backed down when the police objected. So Uleng did not object when police said they were driving Steve to Pretoria, which was more than 700 kilometers away. This they did on the 11th of September in the back of a van with Steve still naked, frothing at the mouth and unable to speak. In Pretoria, a district surgeon examined Steve and tended to him, but it was too late. And alone in his cell, Steve died sometime on the night of the 12th of September in 1977. Shweme, I think I will pause there for now as far as the biography of Ubaba Biko is concerned.
Thank you very much, Jondo. As you always do, you laid a very good foundation. Giving justice to the memory of a man that has never known justice from the system of terror and oppression. So we truly appreciate that, because it is in the memorialization of Biko that he will truly experience a sense of justice. And it is us who have that responsibility to reinvigorate that sense of justice, and by ensuring that he remains relevant to the minds and the imagination of the young generation of Black people. Remember, we now come to you to explore what is the meaning of Black consciousness, what does it represent in the current epoch, and how is it that we as Black people can use Black consciousness to advance our aspirations, or is it still relevant? And the movements that purport to be adherents of Black consciousness, are those movements still relevant? And if so, why are they not attractive to young people, in particular real Black people, as Biko would put it in his writings? So if we so that we can get a better understanding of Biko's ideas and what they represent.
Okay, sibonge Shweme. Sibonge ndoda amadoda. Sibonge kakhulu Ndlondo for a very insightful and comprehensive introduction. As always, you did an exceptionally brilliant job the last time with Ubaba Hlati, uMangaliso Sobukwe. You have just kept that standard. I must commend you for that. Before I go into the questions you've asked me, Shweme, I just want to state additional detail to the very brilliant presentation that Ndlondo made. After the police, apartheid police, failed to get Obudkai, Umkhuluwa, Kofi, his friends called him Kofi. The friends called him Kofi. After they failed to get Obudkai, they then resorted to taking him to the police station. And they interrogated him. He was 16 at the time. 16. They interrogated him, subjected him to all manner of police brutality. This is what they did to Biko. And after they could not extract anything from him, remember he was at Lovedale at the time, they then give him a letter that he must take to his school principal, right? And he does that. And upon presenting the letter, when they go through the letter is then used to expel him. The letter is then used to expel him. He then sits the rest of the year at home.
Yes.
But as he's sitting at home as well, Obutkaya eventually gets arrested. Yes. He then uses his time sitting at home to look after Obutkaya in prison. And so Undlondo is absolutely correct when he says it was during that period when Kamela, who is commonly referred to as Steve Biko, developed a strong dislike for the sisters.
Yeah.
I also think it's important from a biographical point of view that we show the experiences that shaped him. So thank you, Ndlondo. You reminded me of that. Well, I will just briefly, in answering your questions, I will look at first the circumstances that precipitated the formation of the Black Consciousness Movement. That's the one thing I will look at. The other thing I will look at is Biko's intellectual contribution, and then I will look at post-Biko Black Consciousness, something that you asked us to do. And then lastly, I will look at the inquest into his death and the death of other people. So before I go into the factors that precipitated the formation of the Black Consciousness Movement, I just want to state that as we pause to remember the 74th anniversary of the birth of Kamela, yesterday marked the 48th anniversary of the assassination of one of his comrades, Ubabumtuli Shes, was born in Alexander and eventually moved to Tembisi.
Brutally killed.
Brutally killed. And he was killed because he was defending a black woman who was being abused by a white railway worker, And then on the 21st of December this year, it will mark the 71st anniversary of the birth of somebody we were commemorating earlier this month, Thomas Isidore Noel Sankara, on the 21st of December. On the 22nd, it will mark the 127th anniversary of the birth of one of our great warrior scholars, Dr. Chancellor Williams, the author of that classic, The Destruction of Black Civilization. And then on the 31st of December, it will mark the 102nd anniversary of the birth of another great warrior scholar, Dr. Joseph Ben Yochanan, the author of The Black Men of the Nile. So the reason why those anniversaries of their births are equally important. They are equally important because we must locate Biko within that tradition, and it is what is commonly referred to as the tradition of Black radical resistance, So you locate Biko in that tradition. As you remember him, that's why it's also important to remember some of those pioneers of Black radical resistance, So when it comes to the circumstances that precipitated the formation of the Black Consciousness Movement in the form of SASO, it is important to note that the atmosphere that followed the Sharpeville uprising, right, was characterized by intensified police brutality and harassment, etc. But what it also did is that during that period, Black people were essentially suppressed, and cowed into silence, and there was a lot of fear for political activity after the Sharpeville uprising. What is also important to note is that it is the Sharpeville uprising and the reaction of the colonial state that precipitated the formation of the armed wings of the PAC and the ANC, And it can be argued that it is the actions of Ubau Sobukwe that precipitated the formation of APLA and MQ. It can be argued, because if you look at the sequence of events, you understand. So that is one of the critical factors, that comes into play before SASO is formed. Then in 1959, a piece of repugnant legislation is passed, the Extension of University Education Act, 1959, right? Now that act essentially was responsible for the creation of the racialized or the ethnically divided universities, which we come to have learned, that you had universities for the different so-called ethnic groups, because these are not even ethnic groups, and people believe inside ethnic groups, So the apartheid colonial state created ethnic groups and created universities through that piece of legislation. And Abu Biko then went to university, at a time when that legislation was in place. You had separate universities. But the intention of the system was to make sure that universities don't get used as a platform to mobilize against the system. And it achieved exactly the opposite, the separation of the universities. Then there was something that John mentioned, which was also critical. The presence of an organization called NUSAS, this white multiracial organization, which was a students' union actually, and the SRC is affiliated to NUSAS all over the country. But the problem that Abu Biko had with NUSAS was that NUSAS became the spokesperson for Black views and Black aspirations, And Biko uses a phrase there, he says, you had a situation where all that the white man did was talk and all the black man did was listen, So it is against that background that SASO, the first Black consciousness organization gets formed with all of those factors, So SASO comes in at a time when all of those things are in place, right? Now the next point is, what is Biko's intellectual contribution? Now, this is something which I think is not often shared with people, that when we are essentially talking about this column, to borrow from Unzot, right? This colossus called Biko is a young man. We are talking about a young man, right? His works are monumental, but we're talking about a young man. Now,
at the time in his 20s.
Exactly. Yeah. Now, and he was politically active between the years 1967 and 1977 when he was assassinated,
which is a period of 10 years.
10 years.
If you measure the impact, is an epoch changing.
Do you understand?
Paradigm of ideas that he has created in 10 years.
In 10 years,
and given the age also,
it is very important to highlight that he was active basically for 10 years. But look at the contribution he has made. Now, you would remember there's now a book called I Write What I Like. Now, the book I Write What I Like comes from the essays that he wrote. There is the book, yes, the essays that he wrote for the SASO News Netflix under the pen name Freedom Talk, and then he started writing in 1970. His first article that was published in 1970, the first one, Black Soul, White Skins, where he was dealing with the treachery and the deceptiveness of white liberals, that's what he was dealing with. And then, now, those 18 essays in I Write What I Like, span the period 1970 to 1977, which is less than 10 years. Those 18 essays, 1970. So if you read those essays, you are essentially walking through a period of the late 60s, if you like, early 70s to the late 70s. Through those set of essays, which are now called the book I Write What I Like. Secondly, as part of understanding his intellectual contribution, he does something that was done by two other people before him, if not three. One of them is Muzwake Mbete. The other one is Franz Fanon's teacher, Ame Cesar, where he challenges the notion that white people are the divine leaders of everything in the world, including Black people, because that is one of the things that makes Biko stand out, that unlike the other who are respected as our Black leaders, at an early age, Biko was convinced that white people are not the automatic leaders of the world or of black people. He never accepted that. But you had people older than him who had more life experience, who believed that white people are
epitome and the standard.
Do you understand? You understand? And this is where you also see the early notions of black consciousness being formed. But the point that one is making is that there is an interesting confluence between his thinking and the thinking of people like Lembede before his, and Fenon's teacher in particular, anesthesia before him, Then it's also important to state that, like you said in your opening remarks, he is active for a period of about 10 years, give or take. He helps found a national liberation movement. He helps create an ideological framework. They set up a number of interventionist programs. And he does that between the ages of 21 and 30. Ages of 21 and 30, which is remarkable. And you have people who've lived longer than him,
We've not even achieved half
of what he has achieved, and you can imagine, had he not been assassinated, what more he would have achieved. Interesting also about the contribution that Biko and others have made as part of the movement is that amongst the many organizations they formed, remember in October 1977, when just after he gets killed, the following month, the system then decides to ban about 18 black consciousness organizations, including newspapers, that were seen to be sympathetic to the black consciousness movement. Now, one of the organizations that was banned, there is the Black Women's Federation that was formed in 1975. Now, why is this important? This is important because the Black Women's Federation, which was formed in 1975 under the BBC, the Black People's Convention, is a movement that Biko and his colleagues formed or helped form to look after the interests of black women, after the interests of black women. And this is instructive because there is often a discussion, right, that we have, and when we appraise or when we critique the weaknesses of black consciousness thought in South Africa, we sometimes make the point that one of the areas that require development in the black consciousness imagination, as conceived by Biko and his colleagues, is the area that looks at the liberation and the conditions of black women, and the Black Women's Federation was an attempt to do exactly that. And one of the interesting things about one of its policy positions, and it's something we are debating now with the re-emergence of the Black radical feminist movement, is that one of the positions of the Black Women's Federation was that they are not going to collaborate with white women's organizations like Black Sash. Something that you see as a theoretical weakness, in my view, today amongst some of the feminist movements, where they argue that they do implicate white people in the problem of racism and black women also suffering racism, but then they go and form an alliances with the very beneficiaries of racism, which is a contradiction, if that's a principled position, And so it would be interesting to have that type of a discussion about what happened to the Black Women's Federation, because it was a black consciousness women's movement, and whether there is a need to have a deeper discussion about black women activism in the black consciousness space today. What is the state of black women activism in the black consciousness space today? Having said that, it is also critical to note, before I come to the next point, that between 1973 right? And say 1977, the system intensified its clampdown on the Black consciousness movement, arrests, bannings, and assassinations, especially from March 1973, the system was just on steroids, So what then happened is that the Black consciousness movement now had to find itself existing as a movement that was constantly under siege. And this is one of the reasons why they had such a rapid production of new leadership, because they were a movement in the true sense, and they did not want a situation where if one person is arrested or killed, then the movement dies. So they had to live like that, and this is why there is no movement in the movements that were formed in the 20th century in South Africa that has trained as many Black leaders as the Black consciousness movement. And the Black consciousness movement has trained leaders for all the other liberation movements. Statistically, it is possible that the biggest beneficiaries of the leadership training of the Black consciousness movement is the ANC, including the current president. He is a product, President Cyril Ramaphosa is a product of the formation schools of the Black consciousness movement. He was consciously trained in leadership and many others, that we can
forget the leadership it displays currently and the orientation.
Do you understand? Yeah. So all of that is due in part to Biko's vision, to the Black consciousness movement's magnanimity, So they may not say these types of things, and the Black consciousness movement in its current form may not be as glorious as it used to be, but its contribution is unparalleled in a number of fields, And this is because it was a movement, you see, and it being a movement, it was founded on selflessness and the broad understanding of Black people as a unit.
Yes.
And the Black consciousness movement, if you look at its philosophical orientation, did not look at Black people as ethnic groups or even in terms of party political affiliation, which is the weakness of contemporary politics in South Africa.
But put simply, it is one of the only movements, or the few, that actually had a philosophical and ideological foundation that is clearly defined and distinctive. Yes, distinctive.
So, be that as it may, then we move to something that you particularly said we must look into, post-Biko Black consciousness, right? Now, it is 43 years after his assassination. It is 74 years, marking the anniversary of his birth. What is the state of Black consciousness as a philosophical outlook, as a movement, as a liberation project? One of the things that we are seeing, the movements that are traditionally associated with the name Biko, movements like AZAPO and some of the organizations that broke away from AZAPO, to go and form themselves. There's a movement called BCMU now, When you look at what you regard as traditional BC movements, their state, leaves a lot to be desired. They are in a very sad state, having made a very glorious contribution. And one of them being raising Biko from the dead when there was a project to kill Biko. Organizations like AZAPO, for instance, AZAPO, we know that AZAPO is the movement that kept Biko alive. And AZAPO kept Biko alive at the expense of its members. People were killed just for wearing the Biko t-shirt. Why is it important? Today it's fashionable to talk about Biko, and wear Biko t-shirts. But there was a time in this country where
it was a matter of life
and death, and AZAPO stood its ground, and credit should go to it for keeping Biko alive. That there are people who know Biko today, it's in part mainly to the work that has been done by organizations like AZAPO. Unfortunately, when you look at the state of AZAPO is not commensurate with the contribution that AZAPO has made, And in the face of that, you then had a situation where you have what I would call new age forms of Black consciousness movements that have emerged, and I will share a few here. And they may not necessarily be black consciousness in the strict sense, but if you look at their politics and their orientation, movements like Abahlali Basemjondolo, you know, the Amadiba Crisis Committee, you know, movements like Black Wash, which was Soweto based, and people like Abo Sizandi, you know, which did some very brilliant work. I remember they had a good project called Sia Pambili Youth Pioneers Project, you know, which produced brilliant ladies like Usis Nomaku, you know, yeah. So they did brilliant work as Black Wash. Then you have another similar organization in the Free State at the Central University of Technology called Black Spaces, you know, which is almost like a replica of SASA. So information. Do you understand? Yeah, it's a brilliant and very beautiful development, you know, in Black Space. Young people, you know, yeah, and our brother you know, a very imaginative leader, you know, in his own right. And then you have Arise Black Channels, you know, which is another very exciting development in the Black consciousness space that we just interacted with recently, and we are in partnership, you know, with them. Then you have moments like, which in my view are moments that are in line with the Black consciousness outlook. The Marikana Uprising, you know, in my view, the Marikana Uprising is a moment of Black consciousness or Black conscious rebellion. The Roads Must Fall and the Fees Must Fall uprisings are moments or manifestations of Black consciousness. Then you have the last two I want to talk about. There is also something, and Biko makes this point, other people forget it. Because when you said, for instance, in your opening remarks that Biko did not invent Black consciousness, right? What they rather did, and they say that, is to situationalize Black consciousness thought. But that admission is made in one of the critical essays, the definition of Black consciousness, where Biko talks about Black consciousness being a phenomenon that is pervasive, you know, in the so-called third world, to paraphrase him. So he understood, you know, that he's not going to be dishonest and claim that he invented Black consciousness. But you do find people who, in their admiration of Biko, you know, they want to turn Biko into a deity, you know, as opposed to somebody who is an political and intellectual proponent, you know, of a theoretical framework that precedes his own existence, and he just refined it in his own way, you know. So, and this is why that point is important. One of the biggest Black consciousness movements today is found in Brazil. And you also have in Colombia, which is also in South America, in an area called Cholo, which is where the majority of Black people in Colombia live. You have a Black consciousness movement there. In Central America, in a place called Guyana, where, if I'm not mistaken, this is where one of the brilliant Black revolutionaries comes from, if I'm not mistaken, Walter, you know, yeah. So you have a Black consciousness movement there. And then you also have an interesting development, and we must ask what this development means, called Black Lives Matter, you know, because now anything that is associated with Blackness and Black activism today gets subsumed under the Black Lives Matter hashtag, you know. And if you were to ask me, my own assessment of whether Black Lives Matter is a Black consciousness project, you know, I think it is not, you know, that the Black Lives Matter project, in my view, is more it operates more along NGO-ish, civic type, you know, which would put it in the reformist, this thing, compartment, because Black consciousness is defined by Biko and others, is explained in various ways to make the point that it is not a reformist outlook. You know, for instance, one of the things that Biko says is that Blacks are out to transform the system, right, and make of it what they wish. So in the language of Black consciousness, engaging, confronting the system is critical, you know. And when you look at what movements like Black Lives Matter are agitating for instance, just take one of their positions. One of their positions is that they are calling for the defunding of the police, right? The police are central to the project of white supremacy. You know, white supremacy is sustained every day by the police. You know, now an organization that's radical or revolutionary calls for the eradication of the police, not for their defunding. You know, because the police, the notion of policing in the world as it exists today was not only with black people in mind. And people who are radical in their thinking will know that if we are to reimagine the world or our situation, we will have to do what Biko says. We are going to destroy everything that's on the table, you know, and we will come with our own table, and then we will decide who's going to sit at our table, not go and fight for a place. And like you said the other time, that people are fighting not just for space, but they come with camp chairs at a dinner table, you know. So that is one of the things, that's my critique, you know. And unfortunately, the Black Lives Matter movement is heavily funded by dubious sources, you know, like the Soros sources. And because it's heavily funded by dubious sources, it has captivated and charmed Black people, you know, because there is a vacuum, there is no revolutionary movement that is organizing and agitating for Black people globally. So Black Lives Matter, in my view, it is possible that it was created to avoid the possibility of a proper revolutionary movement emerging. So now it fills the vacuum and it manages the anger of Black people, and Black people think there is movement, you know, when actually it's sustaining the status quo, you know.
It's a make-believe, just like the post-1994
thing, you know. So that's where really I stand with the Black Lives Matter thing. And even in South Africa, I see it has charmed people, you know, and people feel agitated every time they see it, and they think something must be done, you know. And I made the point, I said, Black consciousness, you know, as defined by Biko, you know, deals with the question of whether Black lives matter or not, you know. And Black consciousness actually moves from the premise of the value, the innate and inherent value of the Black person. So from a Black consciousness perspective, the question of whether or not Black lives matter does not arise.
I mean, Biko says also that if you are going to appeal to the originators of violence against people, Black people, you know, it is an appeal. It actually means that you are being naive to expect that they are going to be humane and just and expect justice towards you, paraphrasing. So he had identified already earlier on that it is really not wise or even prudent to want to appeal to the conscience of people that do not have a conscience.
And we always make the point that one of the things that Black people must learn or be taught is that you can't appeal to a conscience of people who have none, you see. And a lot of the political organization that Black people have had outside the Black consciousness of the Pan-Africanist space has centered around that mistaken understanding of trying to appeal to the conscience, you know, we shall overcome, social cohesion, South Africa belongs to all who live in it, you know.
And not all white people are bad. But
do you understand?
Biko also deals with it.
But you understand?
That, you know, there may be white people who are good, but we are dealing here with the majority that presents the thesis,
the system,
which is you know, anti-Black racism. And the antithesis to it has to be Black radical resistance.
Yes, of course. But also, it's important that you see, because one of the things we must deal with at another time is to educate Black people on what racism is and what racism is not. Racism is not a personality disorder. So if you are going to make it a behavioral thing, you know, because in any race group there are nice and not nice people, you know, and that already shows how flawed the thesis is when you want to start from the perspective of, but he's a nice white person.
Yeah.
It's not about niceness. It's about a system that has been organized against us historically. But also, if those white people are so nice, why are they not fighting with their own kind to stop being violent and oppressive towards us? Yeah. So if they want to be nice, can they be nice in such a way that they go and deal with the source of the problem? And this is why it is the height of mental retardation to believe that in order for our things to be valid, we need to have white people in our organizations. The problem, like Biko correctly said, is white racism. Yes. And that is a product, invention, creation of the white community. Now you must go and deal with the problem at source. Yes. So there's no need for them to come and join our movements. Let them go and do half of our job and go and deal with the people anti-racism in their societies. And then they can talk to us. Yes. And this is why dialogue with them is not useful. They can talk to us once they show us the evidence of their work and say, you know, you are no longer being killed on the farms as black people. Your land is being brought back voluntarily. Yes. Those things might facilitate dialogue, you see, because it means they have developed a conscience. Yes. But because we know they have none, we don't need them in our movement or even to have dialogue or conversations with them about our destiny. You know. So then we go to the inquest into his death. Ndondo, you know, was very detailed when he was describing, you know, how Biko was tortured and what happened to him, especially from the 6th onwards, you know. And there's just something that I think we must highlight it again. There's something very strange, you know, or interesting in a strange way. They capture Biko in Makana, you know. They take him to Epai, right? And they do most of the torturing Epai, you know. Now, what necessitated the decision to drive him to Pretoria? You know, it's one of the things that continues to puzzle me. That, and nobody of a lower rank would have taken or issued that instruction because the apartheid state was being run from Pretoria. An instruction must have come from Pretoria, you know. And my suspicion is that they needed evidence, you know, of his dead body, proof of death. Yeah, that look, a decision has been taken by the inner circle of the apartheid general that this man must be killed. And we can't rely on a report from Port Elizabeth. We need evidence, you know. So that is one of the things I can only think of, you know, that
in the same way that Botha, as the Minister of Foreign Affairs then, had to fly to Muzini to identify the dead body of someone.
Do you understand? So there's a lot of historical connections you can make, you know. So it's one of the things that, you know, history will perhaps answer that question as to why that had to be done. And I don't remember that being done with any other political leader, you know, all of the people who were killed that I know of, you know, the thing of being driven like Biko has been driven was never done, you know. So that is one of the things. But here's the thing: when we say Biko was assassinated, Biko was not just assassinated by Snyman and the other police officers Biko was assassinated by the judges. Biko was assassinated by the white doctors, Lange and others. Biko was assassinated by the prison officials, you know, and all the other people who work in those offices who are giving administrative support to those doctors. They are secretaries of the correctional heads, they are secretaries, they are PAs, they are administrators, the people in finance who made all of that possible, logistics possible, all of the people who drove the Land Rover and kept Biko naked at the back. Those who made bookings for the police. Do you understand? Over Victoria. You understand? The people who provided the budget and the fuel for the Land Rover and for them to stop over and buy whatever they bought along the way, you know, when Biko was at the back, you know, dying slowly. All of those people are complicit. In a nutshell, this is why we say Biko was killed by white people, you know, and white people all over the world are beneficiaries of Biko's death. They are beneficiaries of Chris Hani's death. They are beneficiaries of the systematic killing of Mangaliso Sobukwe. They are beneficiaries of the killing of Tsietsi Mashini. All of them, you know. And my point is, the white people who killed Biko have not been held accountable till this day. Yes. And we can't not raise that issue, you know, as people who value Biko and the work that he has done and the sacrifices that he has made. Yeah. But also, a month before Biko was, 11 months before Biko was killed, his friend Mapetla Mohapi was killed in almost a similar way, you know. There's no justice for Mapetla. Zwandile Chazbani, Wellington Chazbani, you know, around the same time with Mapetla. Pagamile Mabija, you know, Pagamile Mabija was killed 2 months before Biko, you know, in you know, and many others. You still don't have justice. In fact, Mamule saying Onkhopotetilo's mother died not knowing who killed Onkhopotetilo.
But he died because, you know, he didn't know who killed.
Right, precisely. I mean,
Yes.
her testimony at the Truth Commission gives you an indication that her health deteriorated, you know, because of that, you know. And then last 2 points is that there are some of the things that fascinate me about Biko is we spoke about he was between the ages of 21 and 30 when he did all of these things. Now, one of the things that he did on the 1st of December, 1976, the US Senator Dick Clark visits South Africa. Biko, 1976. At the time, Biko is no longer the leader, right, of the BBC, formally speaking, you know. Biko decides to write to Senator Dick Clark, 1976. In 1976, Biko calls for the release of, amongst others, Babu Nelson Mandela, Babu Mangaliso Sobukwe, and the unbanning of all the other leaders who had been arrested and incarcerated in the Rebellion trial. In 1976, December on the 1st, he writes a letter. You know, that letter appears in I Write What I Like. He decides to write that letter. And you think of him young as he was and how magnanimous he was. And it is a disturbing thing to know that in spite of what he did, the supporters of the same people that for whose release he called, eventually called him a CIA agent. You know, it's properly recorded in this book in particular, you know, by Kolelaman. You know, they called him a CIA agent. You know, the same people he called, for whose release he called him a CIA agent. And so long before there was a Release Mandela movement, Biko called for the release of Mandela. About Mandela and about Sobukwe and other police officers. And he did not confine himself to people in political,
because his orientation was not ethnicity or party politics,
you know, at his age. And the last point is, at the time of his death, like Kulilongo says, he was on a mission to speak to the New Unity Movement, the ANC, the PAC, and his vision, you know, was for the formation of a united Black Front. And he was killed when he was on that mission, you know. And it is something, again, we must think about as to, given where we find ourselves today as Black people, is Biko's vision and aspiration not the most logical thing that Azapo, PAC, EFF, ANC, you know, is that not the most logical thing we should be doing, especially in the context of organizations, anti-Black organizations like AfriForum? Yes. Shouldn't we be doing or working towards what Biko aspired to? What could be more logical than a united Black Front? You know, are we saying ASAPO, PAC, ANC, EFF are more important than black people and the unity of black people. You know, Kanti, what was the struggle about? What was the liberation? A struggle about? Was it not to prioritize and put black people first? You know, and those are the types of questions that this colossus, you know, forces us to grapple with. You know.
Uyibekile kwavokotheka siyabulela nakuwe Ndlondlo ngokuthi usishayelele and you know I want to start where Biko you know defines or merely states what being black is.
Yeah.
And I'm going to state that because I want to link that to how important in his own writing he connects that with the project of emancipation.
Yeah.
And he says in I Write What I Like, merely by describing yourself as black, you have started on a road towards emancipation. You have committed yourself to the fight against all forces that seek to use your blackness as a stamp that marks you as subservient. You know, and there are 2 points that I want to extrapolate out of that statement that Biko makes when he talks about what it means to be black. What we can learn, or the inferences we can draw from there, are 2. First, the importance of identity as a black group, you know, because he had identified that we are not oppressed in our ethnic, you know, divisions or political divisions, but we were oppressed as a black group. And it was important for us to clarify our identity. And this means assuming other identities is an impediment, you know, towards emancipation, because he links the question of identity to the question of emancipation, you know. But then the second thing Biko does in the same statement, he says to fight against all forces. Biko could have easily said to fight against white people, you know. But if you read the essay on the meaning of blackness, you understand that he uses all forces because, you know, all forces could mean anything. And he says, I mean, just because we use it, just because we call ourselves black, does not really mean that we are black, you know. And he coins a phrase where he talks about the real black, you know. And he emphasizes, you know, the reason why blackness as a stamp of subservience persists. It's because there are black people who are aspiring, you know, towards whiteness, and even though they know that it is an impossible, you know, a state of to attain, but they still aspire, you know, and he therefore refers to those blacks as non-whites, you know. Now, given Ndlondlo, where we are currently, and as you said, Sompisi, earlier on, given, you know, the selflessness with which Biko carried himself when the U.S. ambassador, a senator at least, visited, he wrote for the release of all political prisoners. But today we have a movement, you know, that does not even agitate for an inquest into how he was assassinated, you know. And this is a movement that we perceive to be a movement led by black people. But does that really mean that they could be falling outside the definition of real black people that Biko was talking about? And what does that mean for us in Ndlondlo to find ourselves in a situation where we think we are led by black people, but in their disposition, they don't carry themselves in terms of the aspirations of black people?
Shweme, that continues to be a neo-colonial project, where you know, one thing that neo-colonialism does to authenticate or to authorize itself is to give, you know, colonialism or imperialism a pigmentation of blackness. And this reminds me of an illustration that I like using of an axe that had a wooden handle, and the forest kept on voting for the axe because they saw the wood on the axe, and therefore they resonated with the axe, thinking that this is one of our own. Meanwhile, it is the axe ebaqedayo. You know, it continues to cut them down, and it continues to finish them off. And we must then be conscious, and we must be aware that we are used here, you know, and that's one of the things that neocolonialism does. It recruits you to fight against yourself. And it's unfortunate to see many of our brothers and sisters who have been recruited to continue to finish us off and to cut us off, but we still think that they are for us. You know, people like your Barack Obama's, the Black nation was very hopeful to have a Black president at that time. But you'd be shocked to know of the atrocities that not only continued, but were on the rise during his term. Things such as police brutality was very high during his term. And you would think that because of his blackness, you know, we may be protected, and because of his blackness, there may be hope for us. But in fact, the opposite was seen. Therefore, we you know, Biko put it beautifully, and we must never forget that there will always be Black people and there will always be non-whites. And Black people can only be those that are interested in advancing the interests of Black people. If you have no business of advancing Black interests, and you have no business in making sure that the Black agenda continues, then there's nothing Black about you. In fact, you are just used to you know, to continue to cut down fellow Black people. So we must not be naive about matters as they stand. Sure.
Mpemba, Biko describes a real Black man as one that holds his head high in defiance, rather than those that surrender, you know, their souls to whiteness. In our quest to create a united Black front as one of his aspirations, and probably the one thing that you know, necessitated the decision to assassinate him, because that was a real threat to the establishment. In pursuing that aspiration, how do we ensure that we create at least a consciousness of self in Black people, so that they, rather than, you know, hold their heads high in defiance, rather than surrender their souls to whiteness?
It's a monumental task, you know. Monumental in the sense that if you understand what it took for whiteness to produce the kind of Black people like Barack Obama, who said, you know, who are used as tools of Black anger management. And there are other Black people who are equally mentally damaged and think people like Barack Obama are symbols of Black excellence, you know. And these are Black people who are highly certificated. And they are convinced. You must see how they believe themselves. They're confident. People like Barack Obama represent Black excellence, you know. But you see, The trick here is we must understand we live in a system. And a system that was not designed first by us. Secondly, a system that was not designed with us in mind. Thirdly, a system that was designed against us. You know, so we might be the ones who wake up every morning and go to work in our heads.
Yes.
You know, but that is not our decision. It's a decision of the system. You know, and but we can convince ourselves. For instance, when you say you are tired, you know, you feel it on your body, yes, and that can convince you that the physical energy you expended that resulted in you being tired was your decision. It wasn't. It was a decision of the system, you know. But
and that's why you cannot make a decision against
going to
work.
You must think very hard
because there will be consequences.
As a black person, but you convince yourself, you know. So once we understand that, because this thing you talk about knowledge of self, once we understand, because to understand yourself is essentially to understand the nature of your existence. You see, is to understand the ontology, the nature of your existence. That's what knowledge of self is to understand the nature of your existence. So once you understand the nature of your existence, you then move to questions of what you need to do. So some of the things that we need to do, the reason why this thing is called black consciousness, you know, it's because while we may have a similar pigmentation, we may not have the same levels of consciousness about the place that pigmentation occupies in the world. And that's why the consciousness was appended, in my view, that it's important, you know, because the opposite thereof also explains it, you know. So you can be black, you know, by pigmentation and other forms. But you being black is not necessarily a marker or an indication of you being black conscious, you know. And we have a existential and historical obligation to be black conscious because our lived reality and history requires that of us, because we have been turned into things that we are not by whiteness. And so in order for us to reclaim our souls, like Ubamusomu says, you know, we need a particular mental, psychological orientation. And that's what black consciousness is trying to do, because it is a process of trying to help us to return to ourselves. You know.
And Biko says that, I mean, the system has created a lot of black people who are not aware that they are black.
Exactly. Yeah. You know, so, but then at a practical level, you know, I started by saying we live in a system, you know, so at a practical level, it means we must do things that undermine the system every day. Because for as long as the system stands, you know, we continue to be captives, you know. So we must do the types of things every day that undermine the system, disrupt, challenge, and dismantle the system. And there are a number of things we can do. And one of them is to make sure that we build colonies that spread and become networks of consciousness. Because it is only when people are conscious of themselves, like Biko says, you know, that we cannot be conscious of ourselves but continue to live in bondage. You see? Yeah, because he also says that implied in the concept of black consciousness is the concept of liberation. So it's not consciousness to show off, and to just to be haughty, and you know, and so there is a political agenda behind being black conscious. It's not a fashion statement or a cultural jamboree. There is a political agenda. So when you call yourself or a group of people black conscious, you are not just saying people who are aware of who they are, but you are also saying people who have a particular commitment to a particular political agenda, and they would know what to do. So in part of giving black consciousness education, that is the other thing that people don't talk about. That black consciousness, the other implication is a commitment to a political agenda. And what is that?
It's a compass, not,
do you understand?
Not a destination.
Do you understand? Yeah. Towards the attainment of a particular goal.
Yes.
You know, the envisioned cell, a free cell. So we just need to intensify, you know, the work that we are doing. I mean, we are in partnership today with Arise Black Child as well.
Yes.
So we need to do more of those types of things that are within our control and replicate and inspire other people to do the same. Because we must also focus on things that work, have been properly thought through, things that work. And we must also not do things to be seen to be doing things. You know, we must really give thought and meaning to what we are doing. So one of the things I would suggest is to do the types of things we are doing, work more together, you know, compete less, you know. In fact, don't compete at all. Work more together, find common ground, and focus more on what matters, you know, because then you build sustainable projects and platforms.
Ndlondlo, on the, I mean, for me, I want to raise a question on spirituality and relationship with the consciousness. And I'm thinking, just to locate, you know, the genesis of Uchamela is that firstly, he divorces from Nusas in Makanda, you know, and again, Makanda is the same place where he is captured. And we later see his ideas fueling, you know, the roads must fall, you know, and we know that, you know, the settler colonialist Cecil John Rhodes, you know, also has a spiritual presence in Makanda, you know, and it is at a university named after him that he walks out and calls it quits with Nusas. You know, are there spiritual clues in, you know, that one example? I mean, there are many one can use that we can collaborate with the idea of the consciousness in finding, you know, our way towards the understanding of self.
Hey, what a question, Shrem.
That's Shrem for you.
Yeah, Shrem is killing me here. You know, Shrem, I think there are no coincidences.
Yes.
I couldn't, you know, and what this then calls for, it calls for awareness again, and it calls for being conscious about the things that happen around us, even to the extent of paying particular attention to detail. And we then need to continuously, you know, ask ourselves of where we are, where we come from, and obviously where we are going. And similar to the Sankofa bed, that's in Nigeria, that is charging forward but looks back to pick up on things that might have, you know, fallen along the way. I think that is how I would link to the particular question that you are asking me. Even as we venture forward, even as we are, you know, trying to pave a pragmatic way moving forward, we need to be conscious of things that we need to pick up along the way. We need to, you know, pick up these finer details like you are proposing, and see how we can piece all these things together to give us a more vivid and clearer picture of where it is where we are going. Because like I said, just for the sake of happening, and we must continuously, you know, ask ourselves of what needs to be done, and what can we put together to ensure that we move forward.
No, certainly, and Mpemba, as we will be wrapping up, this will be my second last question. You know, you mentioned earlier on a very important dimension, you know, the role of Black women in the liberation struggle. And you mentioned the Black Women's Federation that was established in 1975 as an extension of the PPC. And that was almost, in stark contrast to how you presented, movements like the feminist movements and even the Fees Must Fall, that have got dubious supporters, but also out of sync with the ideas of the consciousness due to the influence of whiteness. How can we ensure that we bring out more the voice of Black women, real Black women, as conceived by Black consciousness, to inspire a new generation of a Black woman or even a young Black girl, for them to be proud of who they are and carry themselves in that way, as an antithesis to the current antisocial, anti-women, anti-Black women activities that we see, not just by whites, but also by non-whites.
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing to say is in the spaces that you and I work, there are many Black sisters,
Yes.
who in our view are in a position to lead our liberation struggle, because we continue to be slaves and captives, who are in a position to lead it at a higher or to a higher level. Sisters like Kikizwa, Yabula, Utandi, Hamwana, sisters like Ulona, Uzandi Khader, those are in my view, those are the Black sisters who, I look to, and who have demonstrated, the type of orientation and leadership that we need. And I think what needs to be done is, in the spaces where we meet and work with them, we must simply just find ways of supporting their work and them supporting the work that we do, on behalf of Black people, so that there is a replication, but also a strengthening of the work that they are doing. Because one of the problems with other forms of feminism, right, is that the impression is created by other forms of feminism that in order to address the issues that face Black women, you need to perpetuate the current hostile, relationship that exists between Black men and women. So there's a brand of feminism that's convinced that that's I'm speaking to those ones, yes, who don't think yes, and I think there is a need for us to create space for Black women activists and us as Black men. We must create a space where we can come together on the basis of a shared agenda. Because this is the one thing I think we have not explored, And I'm also careful that the issue of boxing each other in terms of the ideological
or social construct, gender,
which sometimes do not really have a useful function in practice. Because when you look at things in practice, you get to see a different thing. So I think one of the things we should probably be working towards is to have a platform that we create for Black men and Black women in the activist space to strike a conversation where we are able to come towards a coherent and shared agenda. And that is not to suggest, that we must have a situation where everybody thinks the same, or everybody agrees with everybody. No, I'm calling for a situation where we identify what are the fundamental things and what are the fundamental things we have in common. And in the context of the forces that are pitted against us historically, is it possible for us to find it in ourselves to work together on a common program, and working together again to help people before they get their high blood jumping unnecessarily. Working together doesn't mean you have to join anybody's organization or to change who you are. It simply means you have to organize or coalesce on the basis of common purpose, and that is what I'm really calling for. Let's coalesce on the basis, but we must be deliberate and intentional. We must go and seek out those types of sisters, and we must reach out. We won't always get the type of responses we want, but we must not stop. You see, we must not stop. If we have an interest, we must not stop. And I think that is what we must do, because I think there's a lot of misconceptions that exist between Black male activists and Black women activists about our condition, about our role. And I am not convinced that we can't find a common space. I am more than convinced we can. We must simply just create something serious and have a respectable conversation.
But I think we must also be more circumspect about the social engineering of those differences between us, so that we understand that they are not a product of coincidence, but rather a product of design, by the system to create those disparities between the Black woman, or even that friction between the Black woman and the Black man.
Well, I mean, put it bluntly, there are Black women's organizations, even in the feminist current, that are funded by white people.
Yes,
and some of our sisters who are honest, tell us, that they are funded by white people. Yes. They may sometimes make a lot of the right noises in public platforms, but in private, when you speak to some of them, they tell you, and that is not new. You also have our so-called liberation movements that take money from the very same people they claim to be fighting against. So when we have that conversation, we would have to deal with those types of things. That if we are going to be expected to live up to a certain standard, we must hold each other accountable and to the same standard. So you can't have different sets of standards, for different kinds of groups. But the important thing for me is that we must strive towards finding each other. Those types of things are not insurmountable, and we must not lose sight of
our greater vision,
the bigger agenda, because there is a bigger agenda, whether we see it or not, but there is a bigger agenda, and we must just have the largeness of mind to nudge people in the right direction.
So, lastly, from your side, what are the practical things we can do to pursue, for example, the inquest into Ubao Tamel's death? We know that there has been, a landmark court ruling on other inquests, like, the Ahmed Timor inquest and the Neil Agot inquest. What are the practical things we can do to try and stimulate inquest into the assassination of Ubao Tamel?
So you're asking what we can do on our side to make sure there's progress?
Yes. To realize that.
Sure, I don't think we are putting necessary pressure to begin with. And I think our government is obviously failing us in that regard. But I think not enough pressure is being put even from our side, because similar to Ubabu Sobukwe, there is a serious erasure as well that is perpetuating as far as Steve Biko is concerned, and the issue of his death obviously remains but a mystery. And I think what we then have to do is to be very intentional and to be very deliberate in calling for an inquest that can look into those issues. Yeah, that is as much as I can say at this point, Shane.
Yeah. No, certainly. Mpemba, any ideas on how we can pursue in closing, the idea of the inquest?
Well, I think, remember, we from the side of the Black Power Front had already started an initiative to interact with NPA with the case Kababu Muzwa Kelembele. So we started there. But I think what we need to do, is we must rather build a campaign, in my view, because a lot of people still need awareness and to be educated around this, because people also need to understand why this is important. You understand? Because there is this, how people's memory has been manipulated, that things that belong in the past must stay there. So there is money that has been allocated to make sure that people remember certain things and they forget certain things. So we must understand that we are all not going to get resistance from our own people. We're going to say, but this is izinto zakudala lezi aniziyekeni manje inathi ngathi anifuna ukureconcile nalabo, as if we're interested in reconciliation, Yeah, we want our land back. We don't want reconciliation. So we must start a campaign. Think of starting a campaign where we mobilize, because remember, it's not just political activists that were killed and there's justice that's needed. For instance, if you go back to 1976, right, the youngsters, the children who were killed, those were not political activists. To be honest, the political activists were the people in the leadership. But the hundreds of TNT says machine, over 300 people were killed. He went to the mortuary, the government mortuary. He saw over 300 people. Who are they? What are their names? And his children. His children, where are their families? So you need to show people, when you talk about an inquest to the assassination, you actually want to open a broader discussion, about
the TRC cases that were swept under the TRC carpet.
The over 300 cases of the TRC that have not been followed up. And to make people understand, we're talking about black people here. Whether they are political activists or not is irrelevant, but it's black life and there are black people who've disappeared and we don't. And we ought to do that. You see, we ought to do that. And it's something that, so we need a campaign properly conceptualized that we must pursue, And we're probably just going to use the current cases, but there are a lot of others. But it definitely needs a campaign to sustain it.
No, gentlemen, Iyabulela Manilali for the wonderful insights that we have shared on this occasion of the 74th anniversary of Babu Steve Bandu Biko. And we must continue to do these things and make sure that we memorialize them in the correct way, in ways that even the foundations that have been set up in their names sometimes do not reach the levels of proper memorialization and commemoration of these struggle heroes and martyrs, So I really want to thank you for your selfless contributions, the way in which you apply yourselves to make sure that we excavate, from the graves of history, the bones of memory that will continue to inspire, a spiritual revolution of Black people and the ancestors that have fought for this freedom. And it is in our reconciliation with the land that will ultimately sing the song of freedom. But for your contributions, and we trust that the family of Bao Kamela will be comforted by these gestures of goodwill to try and remember the greatness that he has done to inspire many of us, because there are many of these leaders that have inspired us in our youth. And today, the orientations and ideas that we hold are because of us engaging with their works, and their memory. So, on that note, we have come to the end of this collaboration. between Arise Black Child and Mutapa Afrocentric Lecture Series. We will be wrapping up the year with a final dialogue, just as a reflection, on some of the ideas. It's going to be more philosophical rather than, targeted at a particular subject. So we'll do a general reflection just on how it's being done throughout the period of the lockdown have inspired people. And we would appreciate also your written feedback to us on some of the series that we've had, both as Arise Black Child and as Mutapa. So we appreciate also you following us, because we know it is a costly exercise for you to engage with the content that we share. The platforms where we publish this content are not cheap to access, but we really appreciate that you prioritize it. This is the seeds we plant. These are the seeds we plant towards Black liberation.
Siyabulela.